Hey, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We appreciate you joining today. My name is David Houston, and I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Remo First. We're going to give everybody just a second here to get settled, and then soon enough, we'll be hearing from our experts. So thanks all for joining. I also wanted to encourage everybody, we have a chat function available and the ability for you to submit questions while we're talking today. So if you have a burning question that comes out of some of the answers that we're hearing from our experts today, feel free to jump in with that, and we'll do our best to get to that. If we can't answer it directly, we can follow up with you after the event as well. But all right, I think we're about ready to get started. So as I said, I'm David Houston. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer here at Remo First. If any of you are not familiar with Remo First, we're a global employer of record. We operate in 180 countries around the world, and we help our clients hire talent in markets where they don't have an entity or hiring infrastructure in order to do so. And given that, and some of the focus of my career over the last 15 years, I'm thrilled that we're going to be talking about international expansion today. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And we have a few expert guests who are in an incredible position to provide advice to businesses on how to think about strategies, tactics, and insights around how to be successful at global expansion. And so we'll hear from those experts in just a minute. It may be very obvious to many of you who are attending today, but expanding globally can unlock so many incredible opportunities. It can unlock revenue opportunities. It can unlock talent opportunities. It can help you diversify your global revenue streams. There are cost savings opportunities, and you'll have to forgive the pun, but we want to help you unlock that world of opportunities, and that's what today's session is about. The reality is that as enticing and as exciting as global expansion sounds, the road to global expansion is just littered with the carcasses of businesses that have not done this right, and they haven't gone about it the right way. And so Klaus and Aaron are here to help us sort of avoid those pitfalls. And so with that, I'm going to ask Klaus and Aaron, the authors of Global Class, to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about why there aren't many better people in the world to be able to share insights on this topic. So Klaus, how about over to you first?
Sure. Excited to be on the call with you today, David, and thanks to the Remo First in inviting us to be a part of the webinar. So my name is Klaus. I've been in the international expansion space for also the past 15 years. My career started in Vietnam. I was a part of a relaunch team for Carlsberg, one of the biggest beer brewing companies in the world, who had been there since the mid-90s, and kind of relieved the team in 2011. We came in as a relaunch team together with the second in command to the CEO of Carlsberg to figure out new strategies and new products to enter into Vietnam to essentially establish a better footprint for that market. And then I came to Silicon Valley. Most of my work has been helping startups and companies enter into the Bay Area. Over the course of the many years, almost a decade, Aaron and myself, we have worked with more than 2,000 founders from more than 50 countries. And in that work, we saw a lot of challenges along the way, and we got a little bit tired to repeat the same things all the time. So much so that we decided to write a book called Global Class, which is the playbook for building a global company, but also shares very practical tools to help enable growth and unlock growth in international markets, providing that framework in terms of how to think about hiring, team building, localization management, and so forth. And so we're excited to be on the call today with you and to obviously share some of those insights. Aaron?
Well, thanks, Klaus, and David, thanks for having us. Aaron McDaniel. I'm a California native. I started my career at AT&T, worked in a number of places, including with a joint venture that AT&T had in China. And then after that, I had a second career almost as a serial entrepreneur. Started a number of companies. Some failed. 3 were acquired. After the exit of my last company, I was asked to teach entrepreneurship at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business, where I still teach today. And then, as Klaus mentioned, we teamed up to start helping companies all over the world, and have continued doing that through consulting engagements, in addition to the Wall Street Journal bestseller book we have.
Very good. Well, thank you both again for being here, and I'm excited to get into it. And Klaus, as you said, it's a playbook for building a global company, which is hopefully, part of what, the listeners will get out of today's session. So what I'd really like to start with is I'm sure for a lot of founders and CEOs, an important question comes up as you've started a business, you're starting to engage with customers or developing a product. Really is just when should you start in that whole life cycle, thinking about global expansion and new international markets as an opportunity to grow your business?
So one thing we actually talk about in the book is that you don't, and I know some companies, especially early stage companies, they think about wanting to be born global. And I think that's often a mistake because you can't attempt to be anywhere and everywhere all at once with how diverse it is everywhere. And so we typically recommend finding a market to have that initial place for product market fit as a lifting off point to go globally. But what we do talk about is thinking global day one, meaning building your team, your product, your processes, your company culture in ways that can be universally appealing and localized. And what that often means, and this is particularly difficult if you come from a large market like the US, is that you don't hard code your business for that first market. And so it's about building in flexibility to things, because when you do that, it's much easier to add country 3, 4, 5, 10 if everything isn't only made for that one market.
And so to speak also directly towards when, it also often depends on the market that you're in. Sometimes the market is very small, so companies tend to expand much earlier. Let's say you're from Denmark, you tend to expand earlier as compared to the US. But it also depends on your business model as well. So let's take Flexport as an example. Freight forwarding, they had to expand much earlier because the business model is essentially international. So they already expanded around Series A to, for example, Netherlands as a market there. But then there's the other thought is also, where is your first initial market? That may not be in your home market, so to say. For example, Zendesk started in Denmark in building the technology, but they quickly realized that the business model that they had didn't really, make sense to essentially scale in Europe or in Denmark. They actually came all the way to the US. They initially started in Boston. They quickly realized even in Boston, it didn't make sense because the adoption of sort of SaaS technology and platforms was not really the common and the norm even there. So they went all the way to Silicon Valley. Another example is Zipline, which is a medical drone delivery platform that started in San Francisco, but medical drone delivery as a problem is not big in the US necessarily. Plus, there's also a lot of regulation. And so they started all the way in Rwanda, Africa. So it really depends on the business model. It depends on the market that they're in. It also sometimes depends even on the mission and vision of the overall company and the founder's mindset as well.
That makes sense. And one of the things I really appreciate about the way you guys address your insights, both in the book and already today in this conversation, is you're giving real actionable examples of companies who have tried this. These are companies that all of us are familiar with, as opposed to this just being sort of philosophical and without real examples. So thank you for that. And that's also not the first time I've heard that Boston lags behind Silicon Valley in terms of adoption of new technology. As a Bostonian, that always hurts to hear. But so in that Zendesk example, you talked about their sort of selection of various markets. And so now that we've covered a little bit of the when, I think it would be interesting to see, how do you start talking to founders about which markets to choose? And I think you've got, a really nice framework for that, but would love to dive in on that as well.
Sure. Maybe I'll set the foundation and Aaron can add a few nuances to it. So one of the big things that we do with organizations is helping to map out where to go, when to go, what strategies, and then also how do you effectively operationalize global expansion. And so we built a very specific tool and framework called the Global Growth Opportunity Matrix, which takes 4 key things into account. One, what is your organizational capabilities, right? Do you have the right alignment as a leadership team? How do you think about building the organization overall in terms of talent and diversity? How do you support localizations once you start to expand? And a whole host of other themes that are important to analyze prior to establishing an international footprint. Because oftentimes there's a little bit, the misperception is that you can hire a VP of sales in a new market and think that everything will be successful. It actually requires an organizational play and also support as well when you go international. So that's one part. The other part is also making sure you actually establish what makes a market attractive. And the traditional thinking is that you look at GDP per capita, a population size, etc. But you should also look at custom criterias that sort of gives you an indicator on whether or not your business model can thrive in that market. For example, let's say you are a financial services company. Oftentimes you look at penetrating the market by issuing credit cards. So you would look at credit card penetration, can you use credit cards, and even the culture of using credit cards. For example, Denmark is higher on debit versus credit, as an example, from a cultural standpoint. The other part is actually going in and assessing market in person to really understand also, or have a relative understanding on how to be successful in that market. So we talk about accessibility and adaptation of your business model when entering into new markets. And so initially, we often caution companies to go into a market where it's too complex because you still haven't developed the muscle as an organization to truly support global scale. And then the fourth part that we actually look at is linkages, parallelization opportunities. So if you go into one market, can you leverage things that's been done there for other markets as well? So building a pathway to global growth. So that's, in framing, that's how we think about helping companies achieving global scale.
Thank you.
And I maybe just to share, I'll share a handful of different mistakes companies also make in looking at it the wrong way. So one, just echoing what Klaus was talking about is not thinking about markets one at a time, but thinking about a sequence of global growth and building your global growth muscle. And usually what happens when companies make this mistake is they go, okay, we were successful, we were making the decision to go global. They pick a market and then they just speed an iteration until they find fit. Then they go do that another time and another time and another time. And then they hit what we fondly call the wall when they're in 3, 4, 10 countries. And they realize they just created 10 different businesses that are impossible to scale and manage in any kind of way. And then they have to go build the foundation from the beginning. And so much of what we're talking about today is building that foundation. Another mistake often made is whale hunting. Let's go for the biggest markets. Biggest does not mean best. I think a great example of that Klaus and I talk about is Spotify. Born in Sweden, a lot of the companies in that space went to the US. And what happened in the US was, one, there was this red ocean. They were fighting with each other, and they wanted to get all of the licensing from the US, mainly US-based record companies. And so there was a big fight around that. Spotify came in and said, we'd like, Sweden and the Nordics. And they're like, yeah, sure. Here you go. Here's your rights. And then there was also other cultural elements in Sweden where piracy, there was even like a party, a political party that was for abolishing intellectual property rights. And so culturally, it made a lot of sense. From an infrastructure perspective, they had a lot better internet infrastructure than the US. So streaming became a lot easier. Another mistake, and I'm reminded of one of our clients, is what we call familiarity bias. So companies think that geographic proximity, or in particular language, is the reason why you should choose a market. And so this one client of ours was US, Canada, UK. Now they're looking at Australia, and then their talk after that is New Zealand. And we're kind of like, okay, there's a lot of other opportunities besides New Zealand. New Zealand's awesome. I love it. I've been there, but 4 or 5 million person country versus, lots of other opportunity. Another couple last ones. One is organic growth, just following where organic growth is. And I think in particular for enterprise, this is a big risk, because what often happens is you have let's say, US headquartered company. They have an office in London or Tokyo, and they say, we want your solution there as well. And so you spend a lot of time building that solution, but you don't actually take the time to understand whether that solution you're building is indicative of the whole market or is very particular to that customer. So you might build something that actually doesn't have broad appeal in that country. And then finally, last but not least, is a mistake is not setting an expansion philosophy, not actually determining what that North Star is. Do you want to only go after big markets? Do you only want to be in a place where you could be the number 1 or number 2 player? Do you want to blanket a certain region, whatever it might be? One of our clients had a stated goal of going from 100 million to 1 billion customers. And some of the markets they were looking at had 20 and 30 million people as a population. And we're like, how many of those countries would you need to get to that goal? So let's figure out that expansion philosophy.
Maybe just to mention a great example of a company that sort of built the foundation initially from the perspective of launching in a new market. So Canva, they had this big goal of wanting to localize for 20 different languages. Now, they didn't go and do it for all of the countries at once. They picked one market, perfected the ability to localize effectively, and then they obviously documented those processes, use that to then accelerate the localization efforts in other markets. So it's really starting from one, building that muscle, as Aaron mentioned earlier, and then scale from there. And to be honest, one of the biggest mistakes that companies make is not building that brain trust and documenting those learnings. So they actually go and reinvent the wheel all the time. And so part of what we do is helping to make sure that they actually do that. What did they do to be successful in one market? Who were involved in the process? What key questions did they ask to identify what needed to change, and all those different things. So it's really, really key to make sure to do that as part of the process as well.
Yeah. Interesting. And Aaron, you mentioned this idea of having a North Star, and I think that kind of ties into this idea of just saying, how are we going to define success in some of these new markets? Is there like a time limit that you would advise companies to put on this? Like if they're not maybe seeing that initial traction, like, is there a point where you would advise your client to say, hey, just give up and like, let's regroup here? I'm just curious if you've had any of those examples where you've had to say, okay, like it's just not going to work. Yeah.
It's almost the opposite. Most companies think it's going to take a lot less time than it often does. They'll put a 9 or 12-month horizon out there to see traction, and it often takes 2 to 3 years. And if you're in a heavily regulated market, it takes even longer. So for us, one thing we work on with our clients is creating an operating system for global expansion to help go from pre-launch to product market fit. And I think when you set that up, especially in the way that we have this, it helps you navigate that piece of seeing traction and going milestone by milestone and making sure you're getting a return on investment.
It also gives more transparency into what you've done. And so you can actually go and optimize different parts of it. Let's say, for example, exactly how to localize in the language. You can then shorten that timeline. So you can be much more specific in how to optimize your expansion efforts.
Got it. You two have already pointed out some of the mistakes that companies make on this journey. I'd just be curious, are there any other stories or examples you can share of some of the companies that have just absolutely gotten it wrong? And we don't want to scare people off. Obviously, we'll shift to talking about some of the companies that may have nailed it. But yeah, what are some of those maybe horror stories of people that went down the wrong path here?
One example that comes to mind, and I think this story has a better ending than the start, is Uber, right? So Uber, very successful in a lot of markets, but they very much had this disruptive approach. We're going to take our model and shove it down the throat of every municipality in the world. And they were successful some places. They were very successful in the US, but China, Indonesia, a number of other markets, they lost out, right? Or had to downshift to another strategy and not stay there directly. And they realized over time this need to not just do things the American way or the Uber way, but to do things the local way. And if you look later in their growth, when they wanted to focus on the Middle East, they acquired a company called Careem. They kept it as a separate entity. They allowed it to keep its own branding, actually. And so it was much more successful than them attempting to fit that square peg in a round hole.
Yeah, and they also changed their strategy for Korea as an example, where they partnered with SK Group and created an entirely new app called UT. So that was a different type of partnership because they knew and understood that they couldn't effectively compete with their own brand locally and actually had to partner. A newer example of a company that have failed is actually Amazon in Africa. They weren't successful there, and there's a couple of reasons for why. One were they didn't effectively localize the content for that market. In fact, when they started to launch in that market, most of the content was Indian content, right? So they didn't really invest fully into localizing the content there. And also the user experience didn't really resonate with the African consumer either. And I also think broadly, they sort of took the African continent as sort of one location instead of actually starting small in Africa in one market, refining there, and then starting to localize for other markets as well, because there are cultural differences in the African region. So really not being thoughtful around their expansion efforts, they kind of like went all in and without really having a strategic plan for it.
Yeah, that's the point about localization reminds me, like kind of more old school examples, like really pre-internet, where people like brand names literally didn't even understand what their brand name translated into in that local market, and that would end up creating blowback. I think these days it would probably make them go viral, so maybe it would have the opposite effect. But okay, good to know. Well, shifting to some of the more positive examples. I mean, again, you've already shared a couple, but what are maybe some of your shining stars of people who you feel like just got it absolutely right and have seen tremendous growth as a result?
I think Spotify is a great example of how they did that. And so they took sort of that contrarian approach to choosing a smaller market because of how that market was ripe for things, use that as that foundation. And then, we're able to continue. I think another good example of a company, and for Americans in the audience, you're probably not super familiar because in America, we don't love carpooling, but the largest carpool platform in the world called BlaBlaCar, a French company. I don't speak French, but when they first started very early on, Frederick, their founder, they called the company Cofouturage, which means carpooling in French. But he kind of realized, no, we want to build a global company. People can't say that if they don't speak French, but everybody can say blah blah. So set that up. But then very early on, what they did is they instituted this strategy they called building for two markets. So they thought about the Spanish market, which they thought was good for their solution. They actually hired people from Spain, had them move to their French headquarters, and then helped them, not only sort of indoctrinate them and help them learn the company way of doing things, but also influence the development of the product and the company. So that when they were figuring out things related to things as simple as the app interface, they didn't think just about the French language and length of words. They thought about the Spanish language. When they thought about transportation regulation, they didn't think just about the French market. They thought about the Spanish market as well. And so things to the point, one of the points I made before, it's not hard coded for that one market. There's that flexibility built in. They said, we got to build this in a way that'll work for Spain too. And in doing so, they made it very easy for them to add country 3, 4, 5, 10. They also, in having that company knowledge, paired with the local knowledge of the Spanish employees, when they actually went back to Spain to launch in Spain, they had that great trust built. There was a number of great things that that they had set up to facilitate faster growth in different markets.
Maybe just add to that story is a lot of companies also grow through acquisitions, and we actually like the way that BlaBlaCar thought about it. They didn't go and acquire like a big organization that is already operating in that market that does carpooling, etc. They actually acquired smaller teams that are trying to solve the same problem that they're solving. And so from an acquisition standpoint, the dynamics are very different, right? Because they're trying to solve that problem locally, haven't maybe solved it yet. So actually getting someone in that can be a partner to you, can add more resources to it to solve that problem, becomes a better dynamic inside the organization, almost like a mothership coming in to help and support their mission. And so oftentimes we see a lot of companies doing an inorganic strategy, acquiring big assets, big organizations with legacy cultures and legacy systems. And it's really, really hard to integrate those efforts and align strategies as well. And so sometimes it's actually looking at smaller acquisition targets that may need some support from the organization, whether it's products, whether it's services, or whatever else that is complementary.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's like, people tend to think about acquisitions through the lens of just product gaps that you're maybe filling and, expanding your TAM with a particular customer base. But this is a totally different lens to look at it through. Is just say, what international markets would it be more advantageous for me to just go, effectively buy a subset of customers as opposed to waiting and trying to build it myself. I think that's a good segue, actually. So Aaron, you talked about BlaBlaCar's example of, some bringing the Spanish team into France and starting to understand the thing. And so I want to talk about the who. So we talked about the when, we talked about the where. You guys have a lot of interesting opinions on the people within an organization that could be maybe either the catalysts or the people to execute on these international expansion projects. So tell us how you think about that and who those individuals can be, either in terms of roles or just maybe the qualities of those individuals.
So sure. So basically, we created a terminology called an entrepreneur as international, and the way we sort of laid it out was in the form of a pyramid where there's 3 layers. In the bottom, you have the agile mindset, people who are iterative, resilient, growth focused, and in the middle, you have company mindset, people who can navigate bureaucracy, building coalition to bind. And then the tip of that pyramid is a cultural mindset, global mindedness, culture, curiosity. Because if you think about it, when you expand internationally, you want to have someone that is agile, someone that can figure out what is the right approach in terms of go-to-market and operational model in that market to find product market fit. But then at the same time, you may be 1,000 miles away. So you also need to have someone who can actually navigate bureaucracy and building coalition to get resources and support from the headquarters. But then layered on that again, you also need to have that cultural mindset, because not only do you need to figure out a way to adapt culturally in that local market, but you also need to do that internally as well, because you are starting to become a multi sort of diverse culture inside an organization. So we'd like to kind of frame it around those three key elements to help people to think about who should I hire, because sometimes they take the wrong approach, to be honest. We've seen companies that just say, hey, I'm going to hire the most experienced executive in Korea. He's been an executive for 30 years in Korea. He knows the Korean market, but he may not have been exposed to global markets. And so all of a sudden, you're going to see these culture clashes around your company culture and how he is forcing the culture locally. And so Evernote is a great example where they did that initially. And so they actually hired in the beginning didn't align with the flatter culture and the autonomy sort of culture that they actually wanted to grant into that local market, but instead actually implemented a much more hierarchical approach in managing the team. And that sort of limited their ability to have effective feedback loops and communicate amongst each other to then find that fit in the Korean market. So instead, actually, they fired that person or relieved that person from his role. And they actually took an employee that was already there, a younger female, and then actually coached her up to become the GM of Korea. So we see far too many organizations actually think about the most experienced person is the person we should hire, but actually you should look at people with the right mindset.
Makes sense.
Another important point is these entrepreneurs are not just people who move away from headquarters to go launch a business in another market. The idea is to have this type of mindset anywhere and everywhere across the organization. And one of the structures we created, and so to some of the things Klaus was talking about, is this team building framework. And one of the key elements of that is having a strong overlap between company knowledge and local knowledge. And so we like to say that we're declaring war against the concept of an expat. That person who comes in and is going to tell everyone locally how to do things.
Yeah.
But on the other side, just hiring a local person, sending them to headquarters for a few weeks for a an orientation is not enough. And so it's about being more mindful about that piece. But one practical side of things, in terms of identifying these entrepreneurs that probably are already in the organization, the shorthand is to look for people who have formative experiences that are international, whether that is how they grew up, maybe some of their educational experience, some of their professional experience working as someone generally away from their home country, who would have an understanding, not just, oh, they're well-traveled, but actually having done business and living in another place.
Maybe just add a quick comment here. Part of what we do as well is to help establish and educate and hire for the new markets team that are supporting international. And also there, it's important to hire the people with the right mindset. Because structurally, if you don't do that, you'll have a tendency of that team being biased towards the headquarters side of things, right? So I really want to make sure you hire the right people that has that curiosity and willingness to help local markets. And so the way that team is structured is that it's a cross-functional team that sits within, it can be distributed, but headquarter, and is essentially an enabler and supporter for local teams. So they become sort of the link between local markets and the different departments, whether it's engineering, whether it's marketing, or the likes, right? So it's really, really important as you grow in scale and as the company matures, you also need to build more formal structures that helps build that bridge between new markets and also the headquarters.
Okay, makes sense. So we had at the bottom of the pyramid, you've got agile mindset. We've got then people with company knowledge, and then at the top you said cultural curiosity, effectively.
Yes.
So okay, those make sense. And Remo First, I've worked in global companies my whole career, but Remo First is probably the most geographically diverse. And that cultural curiosity comes in, really, really importantly in your day to day. Like, I'm not just getting on a Monday call and be like, oh, did everybody see the Red Sox game yesterday? Nobody saw the Red Sox game. I need to be much more mindful of what's going on in the rest of the world. And it's a lot of fun to be a part of teams like that, but it does require a fair amount of work. Aaron, I love what you said about, kind of killing this idea of the expat, because it's right. I mean, we support expats. We help with visa sponsorship and that sort of thing around the world. But this concept that you were going to kind of take somebody, move them to some new part of the world. They're going to be adjusting to a new home, potentially new schools for their kids, a new language, and the idea that they're going to be the most effective person to help with this business's expansion is kind of crazy when you think about it in hindsight. So
well, and also it doesn't necessarily mean that that person shouldn't go, but you need to be mindful about creating that local knowledge as well. So
yes,
we're not here to tell you this is the one formula, but we've seen lots of ways companies, they'll hire co-GMs. One is from the market, one is from headquarters. Sometimes that role of the person who comes from headquarters is to identify, train, and transition a local person. So there's different ways to go about it.
It also just reminds me of a story that, for example, Troy Malone from Evernote shared. The way that he thought about it in terms of entering into a market like Taiwan is that he wanted the office to be near the night market, not in the financial district, but actually where they can get a better sense of the local culture. Right. So even thinking about where you place your office. And also another story it reminds me of is, for Carlsberg, I remember my boss, he came over to Vietnam and he was riding around in a fancy black car, and we're living in a much more fancy area. And so I think you need to be intentional around like placing yourself where you can actually get better understanding of the culture and not remove yourself too far away. So it's okay to not necessarily sit in the fine ivory tower in the financial district, but actually locate yourself where it makes most sense.
I used to spend some time working for the British government, and we were helping advise US companies on UK expansion, and the number of times that executives would choose their favorite football team as being the central location for where they should start hiring people in that foreign market was a funny one. It's like, let's go to Manchester because I'm a Man U fan or whatever, and with like total lack of regard for where they actually wanted to be headquartered. So I hear you on that. Okay, well, good. Thank you. This has been great so far. And so I want to shift to some of the strategic. I think people think about international expansion oftentimes really through the marketing and sales lens of how are we going to get our product off the shelf in these new markets. But there are certainly plenty of considerations that sit outside of sales and marketing. Compliance being one of them. You talked about ride sharing as an example. There are plenty of other examples where there are actual regulations in some of these markets that I imagine would impede somebody's ability to just jump in and start posting up billboards. So tell us more about where compliance fits into the whole set of considerations companies should be thinking about.
Sure. So what you outlined, Klaus and I refer to as the iceberg. So one of our frameworks is a spider chart with 6 different points on it. And the top part is go-to-market related, bottom part is operational. The middle, the sort of bullseye in the middle, is the model you operate in your initial market or where you found product market fit. And so the iceberg fits. Most companies think, okay, we're going to go to Mexico. Let's change to pesos from dollars. Let's change to Spanish and change some of the marketing language, and we're localized. But as you were alluding to, there's so much under the surface. Just new entities, taxation, government regulation, hiring new teams, dealing with infrastructure. If you go to Germany as an example, German citizens' data has to stay in country. So you can't use an outside cloud instance. So you got to figure out the infrastructure of how you deliver your product. There's even just other simple things. One story on the product side that Klaus and I like to tell is around LinkedIn. They were going into India. And in India, in a lot of the areas, it's a 2G network. So their graphic heavy app did not load very well. So they had to create a new version that was very text-based that they internally called LinkedIn Lite just to be able to address that. So there's this whole side of things that you need to think about that is below that surface of the iceberg. And I think the benefit, maybe tying a couple concepts together that fall under that iceberg, from an infrastructure perspective, if you were launching a business 30 years ago, you'd have to go buy servers in all of these countries and figure out individual considerations, configurations, etc. Now you just use your cloud provider of choice, AWS or whatever, and you just turn on an instance. Pretty easy. From a similar perspective, I think that's where a lot of service providers like Remo first come in, where you're not saying we're going to go reinvent the wheel and figure out how to hire people in every single market. Like, let's use someone who can help you spin up that market much quicker. And so that's why we really recommend that you work with a suite of partners that help in these key areas, just like you would with an AWS for your cloud infrastructure.
And that's where we often partner with firms like Remo First in helping companies understand some of these local nuances. In fact, also we call upon them when they do discovery of new markets, helping them to understand what are some of the local nuances to operate there from HR standpoint and all that stuff. Simple things like, let's say you go to the Philippines. Oh, hey, there's a 13-month salary that people expect in the Philippines. Otherwise, they're going to be demotivated, etc.
Yeah.
Or let's say it's really, really hard to wind down an entity in Korea, let alone even firing people in Korea can be a challenge, because kind of what you have to do when you fire people in Korea is you have to agree with the employee that they're getting fired, because there's very, very strict employment laws. So really, someone like you, David, and your team around the world can really help them understand how should they approach these that may seem like basic things, but are hugely important and can have big risk in terms of financials as well.
Absolutely.
And maybe just to talk practically about how to do that.
Right.
So we have an exercise that we help companies go through that we call the business model localization canvas. And the idea is, how do you translate your validated model from where you operate to your hypotheses for how you would need to operate in that market? And this goes to all of those categories of that spider chart we were talking about, go to market and operational. But the key to do that, map out what has worked in your home company, country, initial market, whatnot, and then highlight the key questions you need to have answered. Okay, let's say you have a subscription agreement. Well, key question would be, does a subscription model work in this country?
Right.
And you list all of those different questions out. Those will help you identify who to go talk to, people-wise and other resources. And we've been talking about this, maybe to be a little more direct about it, then you run everything through two key filters, government regulation and culture, that affect all of those different elements. Like we were just talking about things like compliance, very much government related, but then a number of things Klaus talked about, and otherwise, with hiring and whatnot, there's a culture side to it as well. And that helps add some structure for how do you actually translate what has worked where you operate to what could work in another place.
And it mitigates against some of those risks that comes when you expand internationally. For example, let's go back to Amazon. A simple question could have been, will our UI and experience resonate with an African consumer? That's one, right? Will Indian content resonate with an African consumer, and so forth? Or LinkedIn did it very well when going into Japan. They asked themselves, will the value proposition of hiring resonate in Japan? It did not, because in Japan, they rarely change jobs. So they instead focus on getting better at your current job because they stay in the jobs for longer. And so really understanding these elements and having the right questions identified help them and lead them towards understanding how to get product market fit in the new market.
I love that example of just shifting the focus from a value proposition perspective, with LinkedIn. That's a really great example. And then, I think back to your point on the people side, a lot of the, examples you're providing today are companies that today are very recognizable to all of us. We all know LinkedIn, we all know Canva, but at some point when they were hiring that first employee in that next market, nobody had heard of Canva or nobody had heard of Evernote. And I think getting it wrong on the people side and not going into that conversation with that person that might help you unlock that new market, not understanding what benefits they normally would be provided locally, not understanding salary benchmarking locally. As you said, Aaron, there are plenty of partners out there that can help you do that thing. So shame on you as a business if you don't ask those questions first before you go sit down across the table from that key hire. So good.
And maybe to make a couple of relevant points to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It is not easy, but it is such a great investment. The reason why is if you don't have those conversations on the front end and you're reactive, that's where you're going to waste a lot of time and money when you do things a certain way. And then you realize that didn't work. And now you got to go invest more and more and more, if you don't hire the right people, if you don't, execute on that right strategy that you learn ahead of time.
And it goes back to setting expectations from the beginning, because if
Right.
you set different expectations in the beginning, it's going to be hard to change that from a leadership standpoint and organizational support standpoint, right? So if you just go in and try to figure things out reactively, it's going to be hard to then communicate that back to teams.
Yeah.
So actually doing it up front will help make that journey much easier down the road.
Good. Well, I imagine there's a reason why you wrote this book, and there's a reason why I've, stayed in the space around international expansion most of my career. One, I mean, it's exciting, it's interesting. There's always new challenges and new opportunities. But I think, I'm sure you have some opinions on when companies get this right, like the upside for their business is so huge. And so I'd be interested for you to talk about, based on what you've seen, whether you have any statistics around this, like when companies get this right, like what does it do to revenue? What does it do to bottom line? Does it open up acquisition opportunities? Just talk us through kind of why you care so much about this topic and want to help businesses with it.
Well, we've been working in the expansion space for quite some time. And so we really wanted to go and solve that big problem in helping to make that path much clearer to people, and creating very, very clear decision tools to help them navigate through all these different phases of global expansion. And I think one of the hardest part, to be honest, in working with organizations and leaders sometimes is the sort of the big challenge of aligning around growth levers inside an organization. And so when we meet with leaders, oftentimes they are prioritizing new products, they are prioritizing new segments, and new markets is the lowest prioritized growth lever. But it is our opinion that going international can actually increase your company valuation much more than creating new segments or creating new products. And so that's what we try to change in the dynamic inside the organization. And so usually the way that we do it, and that is proven to be most effective, is when we run what we call our global capability score assessment. That is an assessment that we have online. It's a survey. You can find it on globalclasscompany.com. But it's not just one person taking that assessment, but it's actually the entire C-suite taking that assessment, where we then go in and analyze what are the misalignment areas within the organization around growth levers, alignment, how they envision in building the organization in terms of team, structures, and all of these different things. And then we go and actually socialize these key tools and key themes that we have learned over time to make sure that we increase the confidence of global, that increases the conviction towards global, that then leads to an increased commitment towards global. Because oftentimes where global expansion fails is when that does not exist. And in particular, also the resources are not available to support global expansion effectively, to the point of Amazon example a little bit earlier. So that's our ultimate goal, to kind of help bump that up as a higher priority inside the company.
And often this magic thing happens with the companies that are successful going global. And it's not scientific per se, but somewhere when revenue from international becomes 30 to 40% plus, all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, this matters a lot. It's just how hard, how much money is wasted, how much time is wasted, how many battle scars for the people fighting for it happen before that magic moment. And so companies who plan for this, as Klaus said, align the growth drivers, understand the potential, and use some of the structures we're talking about, that's going to help with fewer scars, less time, less money that needs to be invested to get to that magic point.
But also to the point earlier, companies like Remo First can actually help de-risk a lot of these things, because building small and agile teams in new markets can be a way of actually doing discovery over time, right? So you hire talent that are, high potential talent in key markets that you're looking at potential future strategic markets. And then as part of the role and scope is to identify whether or not that there's an opportunity in that market. So doing those assessments, understanding that market, and then obviously making maybe a future or a higher potential investment into actually accelerating growth in that market. So I really think partnering with a company like Remo First can help accelerate that growth, but also de-risk expansions as they move forward.
And I love some of these frameworks. I think it's super valuable insights. And I think to echo that point about like the value that it creates for potential investors, revenue opportunities. I mean, we've raised over $40 million. And I think one of the, key points of that discussion is that this is a model that is relevant in nearly every country around the world, whether you're a US company hiring in Singapore or a company based in Singapore hiring in the US, that opportunity is there. But back to like why to apply these strategies is investors don't just want to hear that there's potential. They want to see that you've, shown some proof that you can enter those new markets successfully, that you can communicate with those new customers. And I think that's kind of the whole idea of, read the book, take the global class and figure it out. So that's great.
Can I just share a funny insight that we've learned a little bit over time is that we see a lot of companies actually hiring McKinsey, Bain, BCG when they are, sort of having on the horizon an IPO.
Yeah.
So they bring in Bain, BCG, and McKinsey to do this fancy global expansion report that then actually collects digital dust and is not acted upon. So that's an interesting insight a little bit in terms of they're trying to increase a little bit the value perception of the company by doing this prep work, but actually not acting on it, to be honest. So we often recommend a little bit against that and actually doing something instead with it.
Good. I have one more question before we wrap up, and we, thank you both again for all of the incredible insights. By the way, for folks who did attend, we are going to raffle off access to a masterclass that Klaus and Aaron created, which kind of takes you through some of the key themes. I think it's valued at least $1,000, and we're going to raffle that off for one of the attendees, and so we're excited about that. I guess maybe just one to end on, and if either of you have a quick point on this is. I do think that there's a perception that this, global expansion idea is reserved for enterprise companies that, and again, we've talked about a lot of big names, but as you said, you talked to a ton of startups. Is there a kind of lean version or maybe some tips you'd have for that early stage company that's really starting to tackle it for the first time?
Sure. And real quick, one other thing that I'm sharing right now in the chat, we have a market prioritization playbook.
Perfect.
It's, it talks about some of these concepts. It also will get you on our email list to get something that we're developing now. It's, annual planning is around the corner. So we're building an executive level guide for how to think about international when it comes to annual planning. So check those things out. But to answer your question, what we've seen is this was sort of our challenge, was how do we think about this so that it's not, here are the 20 steps to take that only work for Silicon Valley consumer app companies. We thought about all of these things at a high level and created structures. Think about it like a common language, just like around Agile, we talk about product market fit and MVPs and pivoting. We've created a lot of that structure with entrepreneurs and talking about complexity and other things that help with that dialogue internally. But what we've seen has been accelerated in particular because of the pandemic is how companies are approaching global. And so you go back to the 1990s, companies that won out in a lot of markets understood the power of the internet. And so they adopted that, but often that was really product related or maybe channel related. But when you actually look at what's happened with global talent, that's something that touches every department. And so companies, especially those who were born during the pandemic, they did not have an office where they physically built everybody up and only got talent in one place and only built for one market. They have that locked in diversity, and it's going to be a competitive advantage when they are building themselves in a way that they are thinking global from the very beginning, like we were talking about earlier.
Maybe just to share an example of one company that we've spoken to quite a bit. I'm not going to say the name, but it's in Korea, and it's an organization. They are around 600 people, a very fast growing scaling business in Korea, where they're in fact the market leader. We had a meeting with the CEO and founder and the C-suite, and we asked them a very simple question. How many languages do you speak at the office? And they kind of giggled and smiled a little bit and said maybe 3 languages. Right now, they're trying to scale into Indonesia, Japan, etc., and they're not really successful. And the big reason for why is that way that they built the organization initially. It's a very Korean, hard-coded business where the engineering team is Korean and all the other different supporting functions. And when you have that dynamic, there's a tendency to have a bias towards the Korean market. And to that point made a little bit earlier, lack of curiosity to support international. And even so much so, the CEO and founder does not speak English, and he's also timid as well as a human being. So there's a little bit of that like reaction towards like not overcommitting towards international, but want to reserve and conserve the success that they have in Korea, as an example.
Good. Well, thank
So
you.
practically, how does that work?
Yeah.
Well, the legacy mindset is we are going to find the best, most talented people who happen to be located near where we have an office, or happen to be located where our headquarters is.
Yeah.
And these global class companies that have been successful, they say we're going to find the best talent wherever they happen to be.
Yes.
And then we're going to leverage not just their functional expertise, but their local expertise as well.
Yes. And that is what we call freedom of work. That's our tagline. And we love that idea of just saying the best talent wherever they may exist. And I think that's one of the most exciting parts of the world that we're living in from a business perspective in 2024. And I think that will continue forever. So Klaus, Aaron, thank you both very much. I would encourage everybody to pick up the book, check out the market prioritization playbook, check out the raffle for the masterclass as well. Again, thank you both for the insights. This was really fun and interesting. We hope we can do it again soon. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up today's session. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you. All right. Bye now.